Welcome to The Debate. Our focus today is Martin Luther's 95 Theses, the document that, really kicked off the Reformation back in 1517.
Right.
And the central question we want to grapple with is this. Did the Theses succeed primarily because they offered a truly profound theological alternative rooted in piety and the gospel, or was it more because they just forcefully exposed the ethical and financial abuses of the church at the time?
A classic question.
It is. And I'll argue that Luther's main priority was fundamentally a call for theological reform. That's where I stand.
And I'll take the other side. While look, the theology is clearly vital. I'm going to argue that the immediate power, the reason they spread like wildfire, really stemmed from exposing the corruption, the predatory nature of the indulgence system. It tapped into real public outrage over, frankly, financial exploitation.
Okay, well, let me lay out my position then. It really rests on Luther's singular emphasis on genuine internal repentance. He wasn't just arguing policy details. He was demanding a complete spiritual overhaul. I mean, Thesis 1 is famous for a reason. Christ willed the entire life of believers to be one of repentance. That's a direct command, showing that the real source of salvation is, divine grace. It makes clerical commerce almost irrelevant. As he clarifies later, every truly repentant Christian has a right to full remission of penalty and guilt, even without letters of pardon. That's Thesis 36. For Luther, the core issue is spiritual truth, what he called the true treasure of the church, the most holy gospel of the glory and the grace of God. That's Thesis 62. It puts truth above the church's mechanisms.
That's an interesting point about the internal focus, but I see the driving force quite differently. The immediate punch of the Theses, I think, came from calling out the institutional fraud. And the prime example is indulgence preachers like Johann Tetzel. The critique hit home because the corruption was so blatant, so public. I mean, we know Tetzel was making these frankly cruel and terrible claims, boasting that his indulgence cross was as powerful as Christ's own cross. And, assuring people that even the most unthinkable sins could be forgiven if you paid enough. Luther uses this directly as an ethical hammer in Thesis 45. He who sees a man in need and passes him by and gives his money for pardons purchases not the indulgences of the Pope, but the indignation of God. That sense of outrage over exploitation, that was the ignition point.
I see why you focus on the popular outrage. That makes sense. But doesn't that maybe miss Luther's initial aim? He seemed to want to reform a misuse of authority, not necessarily, tear down the whole institution right away. He even suggests, I think it's Thesis 50, that if the Pope really knew about the exactions of the indulgence preachers, he'd rather see St. Peter's Basilica burned to ashes than built up with the skin, flesh, and bones of his sheep. Doesn't that suggest Luther was trying to sort of protect the core institution from greedy individuals? It points back to restoring spiritual clarity within the structure.
I'm sorry, but I don't really buy that focus on the Pope's, let's say, theoretical good intentions. Whether the Pope sanctioned it, or if it was just preachers acting on their own dreams, that's Thesis 70, the visible impact was a massive institutional failure. It shattered public trust. Luther himself admits in Thesis 81 that this kind of preaching made it hard even for learned men to rescue the reverence due to the Pope. The Theses worked because they function like a viral expose of a systemic rot, boosted by the new printing press. They showed how the church's money-making schemes were destroying piety, and as Thesis 90 suggests, making Christianity unhappy. That institutional critique feels paramount because it was so tangible, so real to people.
But surely that visibility, that tangibility, served a deeper purpose. It was about addressing spiritual deception. The danger Luther feared most wasn't just people losing money, it was false security, the false promise of salvation. He warns explicitly in Thesis 32, those who believe that they can be certain of their salvation because they have indulgence letters will be eternally damned together with their teachers. That's pretty stark. The Theses were meant to force people away from that easy purchased peace, what he calls the false security of peace in Thesis 95, and towards the harder path, the cross through tribulation, Thesis 93. So the theological correction, getting people back on the right path to piety, that had to be the ultimate goal, even if the institutional mess made it urgent.
That's a compelling point about eternal damnation, absolutely. But have you considered how practical Luther's critique was? By contrasting indulgences directly with simple, understandable good works, he gave people an immediate, actionable ethical standard. It instantly delegitimized the church's whole financial mechanism in the eyes of ordinary folk. He taught Christians very clearly in Thesis 43 that giving to the poor is a better work than buying pardons. This direct institutional critique, contrasting clear moral actions with just buying something, that proved crucial to the thesis' rapid spread and success among everyday people. It gave them something concrete.
Well, ultimately, I still hold that the crisis was first and foremost theological. It was about redirecting people towards genuine repentance, a crisis merely highlighted, made visible and urgent by the scale of the institutional abuse. Luther needed to reestablish the gospel's priority to show why these indulgences were spiritually worthless.
And I suppose I maintain that the sheer scale of the institutional failure, the financial scandal, provided the necessary foundation, the widespread outrage for those theological truths to actually take root so quickly and effectively. The rapid circulation, as we both agree, launched a revolution that examined both piety and power structures, maybe inseparable in the end.
Fair enough. It's clear that the interplay between spiritual doctrine and institutional accountability is a deep, perpetual tension. And it's certainly evident right there in this foundational text of the Reformation.